As the story goes, a young man once approached Mozart and said to him, "Herr Mozart, I am needing some advice. I want to make a video game, a big Metroidvania game with platforming and shooting mechanics, compelling characters, and multiple endings. How do I go about making this thing?" "No, no, no," Mozart replied. "This is much too ambitious for one amateur such as yourself to do alone. Why don't you work on something easier, like a short flash game or a walking simulator?" The young man was quite taken aback. "But Herr Mozart, you made Cave Story all on your own in your spare time." Yes," Mozart gave the young man a sly look, "but I never asked anyone how to do it." That Mozart's name? Daisuke Amaya, commonly known as Studio Pixel. Cave Story is undoubtedly one of the most influential games of the last 20 years, predating both the start of the mid-2000s indie movement and the trend of retro-inspired pixel art games that we've been showered in for the last decade. Most impressive is that everything about this game was made by one man, from the programming and art all the way down to the music and even the program used to create the music. Since music is why we're all here, I wanted to talk about a concept that I find really interesting that the Cave Story soundtrack displays really well: the harmonic implications of a melody. The idea is that a melodic line, if constructed properly, can convey a harmonic progression entirely on its own. The reason why this is important is because it's very easy for a melody to meander or lose its sense of purpose and fail to grab the listener, and focusing on creating tension and release from a harmonic perspective when writing a melody can keep this from happening. The same way that it would be tough to keep a song interesting if you only ever used one chord, it's tough to keep a melody interesting if it doesn't convey any sense of harmonic movement on its own. So how does a melody imply harmony? It's all about taking the sound of a chord and creating that sound with a single melodic line. The most blunt approach would be to just use notes from the chord in question. Take the track Access from Cave Story. It's just a single melodic line accompanied by a drum beat. There are no chords being played at all, and yet you can still hear the implied harmony. This D to F sharp is just a leap up of a major third, but that's enough to generate the sound of a D major chord. With the following leap of a third between C and E, we hear an implied C major chord. Alternating these two intervals back to back therefore implies a 1 to flat 7 progression in the key of D, even though no chords are actually being played. If you want to test my theory, just listen to me play this progression, and then compare it to the tune in question. It sounds the same, right? This melody is clearly implying this harmony. A slightly more nuanced way of doing this is through scalar motion. The same way that one small interval can invoke the sound of a chord, as few as 3 notes of a scale played in succession can invoke the sound of the chord that is tied to that scale. Walking up from A to B to C clearly implies a C major tonality, whereas walking down from A flat to G to F clearly invokes the sound of F minor. It's all about what note or notes in the line feel like they're being resolved to, though. You could say that this A, B, C was outlining an A minor chord, or that A flat G, F was derived from a D flat Lydian scale. But when these fragments are played in isolation, our ears take the path of least resistance, interpreting these notes as implying whatever harmony is the simplest or most obvious. Take a look at the melody from Cave Story's main theme. The first phrase runs up an E flat minor scale from the root to the fourth, and then comes back down to the root. This on its own plants the sound of an E flat minor chord in our ears. If we look at the next bar, we see immediately the notes of a C flat triad, followed by the notes of a D flat triad. This is pretty obviously implying a C flat chord moving to a D flat chord, which, if we take the melody as a whole, gives us the sound of a 1 flat 6 flat 7 progression in the key of E flat minor, clear as day. This harmonization is confirmed, or reinforced, when we bring in the other parts of the tune. Notice that even with all the parts playing, there are never any actual chords being played in the strict sense of the word. Most of the harmonic information is being conveyed by the melody, with the bass and accompanying line just reinforcing what the melody is already telling us. This type of harmonically explicit melody was vital to early game music composition, as the early game hardware simply couldn't produce enough voices at once to handle a melody and a chord progression at the same time. Cave Story clearly draws a lot of inspiration from this early era of gaming, and you can see that inspiration reflected in the soundtrack in this way. When taking a more nuanced melodic approach than just arpeggiating each chord in a progression, things can get a little more interesting. Remember how I said that our ears take the path of least resistance when interpreting a melody harmonically? This generally means that we'll hear melodies as outlining either tonic, subdominant, or dominant chords, as these are the most fundamental ways of creating harmonic motion. For example, if a melody lands heavily on the second of the established key, you'll most likely interpret that, subconsciously or not, as expressing the 5 chord of that key, as this note is found in the 5 chord and inherently wants to resolve down to the tonic, the same way that the 5 chord wants to resolve to the 1 chord. You could obviously harmonize this melody in any number of ways, but in lieu of any harmonization, this is the conclusion that our ears will most likely jump to. Now let's take this idea to the tune plant. If we isolate the melody, we see that each 2-bar phrase alternates between implying the sound of the tonic chord, D major, and the dominant chord, A major, or A7. This creates a continuous push and pull from the 1 chord to the 5 chord and back, a continuous tension and release, so instead of a melody that meanders or gets stuck in place, we get this. Notice how each phrase is based off of the same motif, just adjusted to fit the intended harmony. This is a very classical approach, and it makes for such a strong melody. Now, instead of simply reinforcing this 1 to 5 movement with the accompanying voices, Pixel plays around with the harmonization a little bit. We start with the obvious 1 and 5 chords to clearly establish the key before moving to each chord's relative minor. Afterwards, we trade out the 1 chord for a 4 chord, making the whole section into one extended progression. It's still a simple progression for sure, but it's solidly written and it's backing up such a solid melody that it makes for a really, solid tune. Mimiga Town's music makes use of a chord progression that's a little more complicated than a simple exchange of 1 and 5. The melody starts off by establishing a clear F major tonality before landing squarely on a B flat note in the 4th bar. This implies a move to the 4 chord. The next 2 bars see the introduction of an out-of-key note. This B flat to D flat to B flat implies a B flat minor chord, and as the B flat resolves down to an A in the following bar, we can hear the skeleton of a major 4, minor 4, 1 progression. This is, as everyone knows, the most romantic of all of the cadences. No, but it really is a nice progression, and this melody manages to capture the sound of it entirely on its own. After this resolution, we just get a pretty simple walk down to our tonic before moving down to the 7th, which implies a 5 chord setting up the next section of melody. Just this melody alone has managed to imply a decently interesting progression, but the addition of a bass line makes things even more interesting. One thing that you'll find scattered all over this game's soundtrack is a chromatically descending bass line. The bass line pumps out some 8th notes starting on the tonic and descending chromatically all the way down to the flat 6th. This both reinforces the melody's inherent harmony and adds some new and interesting colors. This E in the bass in the 2nd measure could be heard as an F over E or an A minor over E, which would be the most technically accurate definition. But I hear it more as a C over E since the 7th in the bass carries such inherent tension and the melody emphasizes the C note so strongly. The The following E flat is also interesting, implying a secondary dominant F7 chord that moves to the subsequent B flat over D chord. If you looked at this bar in isolation, you could think of it as an E flat major 9 chord, but taking the melody as a whole into account, these two bars sound to me like an F7 over E flat moving to a B flat over D. The next two bars are a similar situation. You might be tempted to label this as a D flat major 7 or something, but in the context of the melody, my ears hear a B flat over D going to a B flat minor over D flat going to F, as this is a much stronger cadence. I love the added color of the B natural in the bass here, turning this melody from implying a basic 1-5-1-5 to implying a much more colorful dominant 2 to 5 sus to 5 chord. It's interesting to note that this is the whole tune, without any parts taken out. It's just these two voices with a pad doubling the bass notes an octave up, and yet it implies such colorful harmony. What's interesting about all of this is that Pixel reportedly didn't know anything about music and just followed his ears when making the soundtrack. I think this just speaks to a level of genius that he must have. I mean, he did make this entire game from scratch himself, going so far as to program his own music creation software, and as far as I know, he never had to ask anyone how to do it. So, let this be your final lesson. Don't ever ask anybody how to do anything. I hope that was as fun for you to watch as it was for me to make. Big thanks to Mark Starvaggi and Vide for the suggestion. If you want to ignore my advice and ask people for advice on writing music, come check out our Discord server. There's a lot of very cool, smart, and helpful people there, and I'll leave a link in the description. Also in my description, you'll find links to my Twitter, which you can follow here, and my Patreon, which you can use to support this channel if you so desire. Thanks so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time.